My name is Joe Peroni, and this is the Rise Above Project. And today I want to talk about an article that I received this week, and it is about Generation Z and mental health. This article was written by the therapist.com team, and it was reviewed by another therapist. So here we have a bunch of therapists writing an article about Generation Z and mental health. And as I was going through this article, I thought I really have to talk about this because although that there's some really good information in here, I also think that there's information in here that I just don't understand how when we have a bunch of professionals, how they can completely miss what's actually going on here. So I want to talk about some of the good things first that I think that they get right. And some of them are just the basics. And I think we have to clear up in the very beginning who Generation Z is. According to this article and other areas that I've looked at, they say Generation Z are people born between 1996 and people being born up to 2010. So with a little bit of math here, these people would be between the ages of 13 years old and 26 years old right now. And in going with this, the generation before that were the millennials, which that was between the years 1981 up to 1996, making them 26 to 42 years old. And I'm mentioning that even though the article is mostly about Generation Z, I'm mentioning that because millennials have many of the same issues that Generation Z has. It's just that Generation Z is, unfortunately, they're going a little bit worse. According to this article and many other areas where I've looked at, what they're saying is that Generation Z has the highest rates of mental health issues of any generation before them, including the millennials. Now, whether we're talking about a professional diagnosis or self-report, we're seeing that Generation Z has higher degree of depression, higher degree of anxiety, higher suicidal ideation. Now, that brings on the question, are these increases because that there's more awareness now and maybe that there's less stigma attached to mental health? Well, although the answers here could go either way, what I'm going to lean on here is that the suicide rates right now for Generation Z are at epidemic proportions. And this obviously goes beyond stigma. It goes beyond self-report. Dead bodies are dead bodies. There's nothing to debate here. So I think we could say pretty much beyond any shadow of a doubt that Generation Z is experiencing massive mental health issues, much more than any other age group. And it's not just because we have more mental health awareness today, and it's not because we have less stigma attached to mental health issues. Now, as the article goes on, and I've compared this to other articles as well, just so I can get a well-rounded group of information here, they have a bunch of reasons why Generation Z has these mental health issues. And as I'm looking at them, they look like excuses to me because it never gets down to the actual root cause of why Generation Z is having these issues. And I think that's part of the problem. So let's take a look at these. And I'm going to go one by one. I'm going to try not to bog you down in too many numbers, but of course that has to be involved here. So the first excuse they use for Generation Z is because of 9/11. Now, as I would think everybody knows, 9/11 obviously was in 2001. So again, going by the numbers, in Generation Z, if you were born in 1996, you weren't even born yet when 9/11 happened. Now, to go with the older part of Generation Z, you were 3 years old when 9/11 happened. So does that sound like a justifiable reason for somebody's anxiety and depression? No. So let's just cross that off the list. Again, therapy.com, whatever that was, and all their therapist team and everybody putting all their brains together couldn't come up and realize that 9/11 happened before a lot of these people were born. And yet they put it on the list as a reason why Generation Z is having problems. So you'll have a person from Generation Z going to see a therapist, and we have therapists who actually believe that 9/11 was probably the cause of their issues. It makes no sense. Let's continue. The second excuse that they use is that there's a high crime rate today. And of course, like if there's a high crime rate, we can all worry about that. Nobody wants a high crime rate. Nobody wants to be a victim. That would make sense. However, how does it make sense really? Because the crime rates have been falling since 1990 in all areas, except for school shootings. And we'll take another look at that. So again, we're looking at a generation of people saying, well, it's the high crime rate. That's a lie, just in that alone. It's verifiable, so why would you say it? And why would you have a bunch of therapists put that down and write that and publish it and send it out to people? It's verifiable that that's not true. Let's continue with this. If we're looking at, let's say, for example, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, what we're looking at is, here's one. The murder rate in New York in 1975 is 4 times as high as it is right now. So again, people are talking about in the big cities, the crime rates are just exploding. Are they? Because that's not true. Okay, that's, again, verifiable. Now let's look at the school shooting part. Now, yes, kids are in school. If there's school shootings, it makes sense that that would bring on some anxiety, for sure. But let's look at gun deaths in general, and some of them, obviously, in schools. Right now, there's too many gun deaths in the United States. I think most of us could agree with that, and something needs to be done. But that's another show for another time. But right now, let's go with the numbers. As it stands now, there's 14.6 gun deaths per 100,000 people in the United States. That's massively high. I mean, we just destroy every other first world nation when it comes to that. However, in 1974, and it's not the only year, I'm just picking a year, but you can go through the 70s and 80s, there were 16.3 gun deaths per 100,000 people. Gun deaths per capita have gone down. So should we use that as an excuse for mental health issues for people between ages 13 to 26? Unless you were directly involved in a school shooting, I would say no. There's no data to back that up. Let's continue. There was something else as I was doing the show I was thinking about. When I was a kid, no different than any other kid, we were told that milk is the thing to drink, right? So you would have breakfast with your family, for example, and you would get a carton of milk. What did we look at on a carton of milk? That's right, a picture of a missing child. And all the time we would compare, like, ooh, look at this kid who's missing. Ooh, look at this kid who was abducted. I bet you they're not alive. Think about today if that would happen. What would happen is that they would probably sue the milk company for causing PTSD in the whole family, for showing a child who is missing and probably dead to a family in the morning who just wants to have some milk during their breakfast. They think about how times have changed. Again, people didn't have these children on milk boxes because they were trying to harm people. They were trying to get help to get the problem solved. Maybe somebody saw one of these missing children. You can't even do that today because just the picture of the child on a milk box is going to cause PTSD and everybody's going to get sued. Now, I think they changed that somewhere in the 90s because of the Amber Alert, but that's just a whole nother story. So again, if you were to put missing children on milk boxes today, think about the traumatic experiences that it would cause for all these people. And then they would be running to their therapist. Oh my God, I can't look at a picture. Think about this. Continuing. Kids now do have to experience school shooting drills. And under the circumstances, I see that as a positive thing. I mean, not school shootings, obviously, but you should have some type of drill just in case you have to prepare for this, right? You want to expect the best, prepare for the worst, it makes sense. And that could be very scary for a child. That could create a lot of stress and anxiety. I agree. But that's about in the year 2023, right? Let's compare that to kids from the 70s and 80s, because I was there. We used to have duck and cover drills. Why did we do that? Why did we have to duck underneath our desks? That's because we were facing an imminent, supposedly, nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So if you compare, as a child, school shootings, which are obviously very devastating, but I would say it's equally, or maybe even more damaging to their psyche, that we had to duck and cover underneath our desks all the time, knowing full well that we couldn't survive a nuclear war, and we would just know this. This was the Cold War. The thought was always hanging over your head that we could die at any moment. So again, is it logical to say that school shootings that are in a sense are extremely rare events, even though they're horrible when they do happen, they're still rare? Is that a reason why, let's say, a 26-year-old has a failure to launch and can't find a good job and can't get off marijuana and can't stop playing video games? Does that make sense? It shouldn't. But people at therapist.com or whoever went through all the channels of having a bunch of therapists looking at this and all gave it the thumbs up and said, yeah, this makes sense to me. I might say that half the therapists out there are causing more problems for their clients if they actually believe this kind of stuff. Let's continue about the crime rates in, let's say, the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They were known for a lot of things back then. Lots of good things, some bad things. Here's one for you. The 70s and 80s were known as the golden age for serial killers. Think about that. You don't even really have serial killers anymore because they have DNA evidence and stuff like that now. So it's very difficult for somebody to commit a crime and to continue to get away with it time after time because of modern technology. But in the 60s and 70s and 80s, obviously prior to that as well, it was really difficult to catch somebody. And if there was an insane human being out there, they could play cat and mouse with cops for 20, 30, 40 years. And a lot of times they just died of old age and they never got caught. That really doesn't happen anymore. I mean, I remember in 1977, we had the 44 caliber killer, and everybody was aware of that. We even had the blackout in New York City then. And the 44 caliber killer was running around there somewhere. Like, everybody knew this. This was like common knowledge. This was a thing that was on the news all the time. So you can't even say that social media is expanding this because of 24-hour news cycle. People talk. People talk all the time. Do you really think that there were people in New York then that didn't know about the 44 caliber killer? That's insane to think that they didn't, because everybody knew about it. Even his number 44, they compared that to 44 as Reggie Jackson. Like, even watching sports back then, when the Yankees won the World Series, it was mentioned during the World Series. It was mentioned all the time. Continuing, let's go with some FBI stats that I find extremely interesting. Now again, overall, my argument here is that the crime rates are massively down in almost every area of our life. And yet we're using that as an excuse for Generation Z, saying the crime rates are so horrible. And we could all connect this back to 9/11 somehow. Well, FBI stats, between 1970 and 1971, think about that. Between 1970 to 1971, there were 2,500 bombings inside the United States. I can't even do the math that quick on there. I mean, that's more than one bombing per day, every single day during that time. I think it's close to like 3 or 4, 5 bombings per day in the United States at that time. You want to talk about political unrest? There it is. Again, it makes no sense. It was extremely dangerous back then. Compared to now, you hear one bombing and everybody's going, oh my God, it's so horrible. 9/11 was a special incident, of course, and it was one of the most horrible things I've ever seen, including everybody else who saw it knows that as well. But let's take a look at some other stats. Between 1968 and 1972, inside the United States, there was an average of one hijacking per week. Think about that. An average of one hijacking, or if you want to call it a skyjacking, per week for 4 years? Think about if it happens now. The whole world will stop because everybody will go, oh my God, I'm so traumatized because something happened at this place where I'm not at. Back then it happened every day. Almost every single week it happened. It was on a weekly basis. So much so that if you were in New York and you needed to get a cab and you got in the cab driver said, where do you want to go? You could say, take me to Cuba. Because take me to Cuba was a joke back then because everybody knew that most of those hijackings were people wanting to go back to Cuba. And so it used to be like a funny kind of a joke that people would say to other people. Where do you want to go? I want to go to Cuba. And would we do that today, or would we all fall apart? I think we know the answer to that. We're seeing where mental health issues are going today. I mean, by today's standards, it's very bland in the world right now. It's a very safe world out there. People are trying to stay away from each other. People are afraid to talk to each other anymore. And yet there's more stress, more anxiety, more suicides. Going down the list of complaints here and excuses. Let's look at politics for a second. Politics right now, it's extremely partisan, more so than it ever was, and there's more disagreements now. That's true. I can use it as an example, Richard Nixon. When Richard Nixon did his things, Republicans and Democrats wanted him out of office, mostly. Right? You didn't have a lot of Republicans standing up for him. Now, you could attack the Capitol building. You could not want democracy in the United States. You could do all that. And a lot of Republicans are still going to just go along with a Republican who thought like that. That's the world we live in. That's frustrating. It's annoying. It's all of that. Absolutely, 100%. And as another example of how people are partisan now and they just don't know how to have critical analysis to think on both sides, let's use Richard Nixon again. Richard Nixon actually was for socialized medicine. And he was actually wanted to enact change because he thought about global climate change. He's the one who pushed, I think it was called Conservation Day back then, or Earth Day. So again, you have a Republican who is pushing policies, right, or awareness about global climate change. You can't do that today because everybody just goes in their corner. And so yes, that's so frustrating. And it's really annoying because you know people are smarter than what they're leading on as. They're just going along with their party these days, and it's beyond frustrating. I get that. And yes, it could be anxiety producing, absolutely. But let's be fair, let's go back into like the 60s, 70s, and maybe even the 80s, right? Again, I'm using those frameworks because in the 90s, crime even started to come down. So let's use 60s, 70s, and 80s. 11/22/63, John Kennedy, assassinated. 6/5, 1968. Robert Kennedy, assassinated. 4/4, 1968, the same year, Martin Luther King Jr., assassinated. 3/30, 1981, an attempt on Reagan's life. I think I was 16 at that time. I watched that time and time again. They kept showing him getting shot and all of the Secret Service. Would you even be able to show that today on TV without a trigger warning? No pun intended for those out there who get easily offended. Trigger warning, gunshot, get it? But the point is that, yes, people are arguing today, and they sound incredibly unintelligent. That's true. And we have no, decorum anymore in politics. That's true. However, the amount of violence and assassinations, even at the Democratic National Convention, you can look that up too, about what happened there and the riots. It's way worse than what's going on today. Today is nothing compared to what it was going on a couple of generations ago. So continuing with that, what else does it say here? Excuses, 9/11, crime rates, shootings, politics. Okay, let's go to unemployment rates. Unemployment rates, just destroying Generation Z. They're depressed, they're scared, they're anxious, they're all of that, they're stressed out. Why? Because the unemployment rate now is at 3.8%. It's at a historical low. Yes, I said that right. They're saying that the unemployment rate is what is destroying Generation Z's mental health. But yet, the unemployment rate now is at a historic low. Right now, there are more jobs out there than there are people who want those jobs. So if you want a job, you can get it. That's just a flat out fact. Now, the unemployment rates, by the way, are not just low right now. They were going lower through 7 out of the 8 years that Obama was in office. They were low when Trump was in office, and they continue to be low when Biden's in office. So we're looking at, since about 2010, unemployment rates have been going down, and they were pretty good before that too, except for obviously the recession slash depression from 2007-ish through 2008. Again, just facts here. How does this affect Generation Z? It means that there's too many jobs out there. That's why when they have a job that they don't like, or they just don't feel like they're getting paid enough money, they just quit. And that's okay if you want to do that, but that's a first world problem. The reason why they're able to quit is because they have mommy and daddy at home willing to fund them, which is something that people in other generations did not have. Again, we have to look at that. So why are they so stressed out? Let's continue. The pandemic. All right, let's use that as an excuse. Last time I looked, the pandemic affected every living thing on the face of this planet. It wasn't isolated to Generation Z. Why would it affect them so much and not anybody else? It's a good question. We could do a whole show on that. One of the things that is very important is that all human beings not to have to go through optimal adversity. That's why if you're Generation X or a boomer, what happens is when you went through the pandemic, you dealt with it. It sucked. It wasn't good. You know why? Part of it is because those generations love people. They get used to having relationships. They get used to eyeball contact and conversations with people, and they know how to talk to people and to also have differences of agreement and still be friends with them. But if you're of a younger generation, you think that you would somehow be immune to the pandemic in certain ways. I don't mean in terms of having COVID, but I mean in terms of being socially isolated. Why? Because they already were socially isolated. Social media does that to people. The average Generation Z person spends 10 hours per day online and not in front of a person. So if you tell them, oh, you can't go outside now, it's like, well, who cares? They don't go outside anyway, on average. Let's continue. Inflation. Inflation affects everybody. Inflation is a big deal right now. Absolutely. We all know this. Nobody can lie about it. You go to the store, food prices are up. But let's take a look at one parameter here. That's probably the most important parameter to see. If we look at, let's say, apartment prices, right? Again, because you're trying to get a good start. So for a young person, you need to get your foot on the ground, right? Stand up and start moving in your life. It's a difficult thing to do in the beginning. So let's take a look at that. What did somebody like me or other people from my generation have to face? Well, in 1980 or so, the minimum wage was $3 per hour. The average apartment was about $600 for the month. Now, obviously those prices can move back and forth. I get that. Some cheaper, some way more expensive. I remember in 1988 in New York, and just to be able to park your car in a parking garage was $600. So again, I'm using a number here that's actually, I'm trying to make it lower than what it should be. So simple math here, 3 into 600, you would have to work 200 hours in 1980 or 1983 or 5, around there, to have an apartment. 200 hours? That's a lot. So let's look at what it is now with this inflation. So in Las Vegas, minimum wage, $10 an hour. Your average apartment, again, it fluctuates all over the place, but let's use the number 1,500. You can get apartments for much less, but you can get them for more too. Let's use 1,500. Simple math. 10 into 1,500, you would have to work 150 hours to afford that apartment. Uh-oh. So now the inflation that we're saying is killing Generation Z, you literally had to work 50 more hours per month in the 80s to afford an apartment than you do, let's say, in Las Vegas right now in the year 2023. Is that inflation? Is it really? No. Again, it's another excuse and another way to complain. Again, you can work out those numbers yourself, but you're still going to find out the same thing that I did, is that even at the very worst, if you push the numbers in your direction because you're trying to prove somehow that Generation Z has an excuse, you're still going to come up with that it really is not much difference than it was for, let's say, people trying to get their feet on the ground in 1980, or 1980s, I should say. Continuing, social media is also bringing Generation Z down. Well, once again, Generation Z is affected by social media, true, but so is everybody. It's not isolated just to them. And when you look at it, Generation Z was born into it. They don't know anything any different than that. So if you're of an older generation, you can literally look at your generation before and say, wow, you know, life is really sad right now because people are not connecting with other people. You know, there's a lot of artistic value in people that are being lost because they don't have the connection with humans, and things are a lot different. You can look at it with your athletes. It's not the same. Sports are not the same. Music is not the same. So when you're older, everybody goes, okay, boomer, and they make fun of you because you can actually feel the depression or the stress in a person who's older because they've seen better things in life. But your Generation Z making fun of boomers and Generation X for their, let's say, anxiety and depression, for wanting it to be like it was, where humans used to care about humans and people had more authenticity. But yet, Generation Z, you were born into it, and you're the one with the more mental health issues. So is social media the problem? I would say that social media is probably not the problem. It's how you connect to social media. Do you use it correctly? Because according to most data, they would tell you that the average Generation Z person spends 10 hours a day online. That's insane. You know, another excuse they give is because they have lack of sleep. Lack of sleep? That's a choice, right? So every generation would be affected by lack of sleep. Actually, the older you get, the harder it is to stay asleep. So again, you would think that people in the boomer generation would have more depression and anxiety, but they don't. They're actually much more happier than Generation Z. So again, none of these excuses hold water. So what are the real reasons? Well, could be done for many other shows. There's actually a lot of books on it. But let's narrow it down just real quick so I can end this show, because I don't want it to be too long for people. When you live in a cowardly, coddling, cancel type of culture, this is what you get. Because again, there's not optimal adversity for kids these days. And so what happens is that they're totally, they don't have the wherewithal to deal with anything. And your average therapist, I should say average, probably all of us actually, we're familiar with the ACE test, Adverse Childhood Experiences Test. And it gives us a good view to see where a person may have some childhood traumas that may affect them and may correlate to their anxiety or depression or mental health issues today. And it makes sense. And this is what it looks like right here. And as you go through these, you would see things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, where your parents divorced, was there a person in your family that was an alcoholic, things like this. So we're talking about real devastating things that could happen to a child that they're not in control over, that can cause traumas. And as the adversities go up, let's say you're in the 3, 4, 5 range, there's a good chance that you're going to have some issues as you get older that you might have to overcome. Fair enough. All the data proves that or shows that or indicates it very highly. However, when you give this ACE test to most Generation Z, what you're going to get is zeros. Maybe you'll get a 1. Because most of the time, they're not stressed out by anything big. Very unfortunate, the way they were raised, they were overly coddled, they were overly babied. And because of that, just anything in this world is too stressful for them. They go outside, they breathe, they go, oh my God, there could be pollution, this is terrible. You know, everything is a problem. They have a talk with somebody, the person has a slight disagreement with them, or not even disagrees with them, it's not a critical analysis, maybe somebody just has a different perception or point of view. Uh-oh, they're triggered now, and now they're traumatized because somebody had a different point of view, and now they feel anxiety to talk to people because they don't want to have a difference of opinion with anybody. So they're afraid to speak to people because people might have a different point of view, and if they have a different point of view, it triggers them. So therefore, they're completely ill-equipped to have any conversations or have any relationships. And then we blame all these other listing of things that I gave you. The truth is that they weren't raised correctly. They weren't given optimal adversity. They weren't told that there's other people in this world that have different points of view. I mean, you might not know this, but people do have different religions, and some people don't want religion at all. We're all different nationalities. We have different cultures. That's the way it is. And they don't know this. It's unfortunate. But that's also the way out. So if we're therapists and we're going to call ourselves loving, compassionate, nurturing, we want to help our clients, we want to meet them where they are type of thing, do you think meeting them where they are is give them a list of excuses so they can never get better? And we give them reasons to feel like victims and to push them into this learned helplessness because you can't deal with the fact that there's global climate change, therefore you need to sit in your house all day and complain and say it's politics is the problem when politics has always been a problem? When crime is the problem, when in actual fact crime is going down? The truth of the matter is that in order to help people, we have to create awareness. And to create awareness, we have to be honest and upfront. We need to tell the truth, and we need to combat this lying and this justification wherever it arises. And according to this article that I'm looking at, there's a lot of lying there and a lot of justifications that are not going to help anybody. Hopefully some of this has been valuable to you today. My name is Joe Peroni, and this is the Rise Above Project. Thank you.